And here's the important first thing to remember. You want your cortisol high early in the day, shortly after waking. And you want your cortisol low in the hours right before sleep and in the first hours of sleep. If you remember nothing else from this episode, please remember that, because if you get those two things correct, everything else in terms of health and wellness and performance, all of that will be reinforced by getting your cortisol rhythm correct. The protocol is to get bright light, ideally from sunlight, into your eyes within the first hour of waking, ideally within the first 30 minutes. Ideally, it's from sunlight, so you would go outside, take your sunglasses off. Eyeglasses and contacts are fine, even if they have UV protection in them. Look in the direction of the sun. Blink as needed to protect your eyes. Yes, you can do this on cloudy days. In fact, it's more important to do on cloudy days. And this is a unique opportunity to boost your cortisol levels in that first hour of the day. If you don't have access to sunlight for whatever reason, you could use a 10,000 lux artificial light. That additional surge in cortisol that can occur only in that first 1 to say 2 or 3 hours of the day, that's a very special time, because it's not just about the elevated mood, focus, and alertness that you're going to achieve during that time by virtue of getting bright light in your eyes. It's also the case that the higher that first peak in cortisol is early in the day, the better you're setting yourself up for low levels of cortisol later in the evening and at night, which will allow you to fall asleep easily, to stay asleep easily. One of those is hydration. Now, of all the protocols in the realm of mental health, physical health, and performance, I think the most underrated one, believe it or not, is hydration. So it's very important that you hydrate first thing in the morning. For me, that's 16 to 32 ounces of water with some electrolytes in it. For you, it might just be water, whatever. The interesting thing is that one of the major effects of proper hydration is to increase levels of alertness, and the way it does it is by acting on the adrenals, both epinephrine, adrenaline, and cortisol release. And we're not talking about big spikes in cortisol related to drinking water. We're talking about modest increases in the levels of pulsatile, as it's called, release of cortisol due to hydration. And again, highly underrated protocol, in part because it takes a lot of dehydration before we realize that we're dehydrated. When you wake up in the morning, you use the restroom, you're probably mildly dehydrated. Get yourself hydrated first thing in the morning. Your cortisol levels will thank you. Your levels of energy will thank you. Now, if you're like me, you also hydrate with caffeine, okay? Now, the discussion around caffeine and cortisol can be a little bit confused, but it might extend the life of cortisol. Here's the big picture on caffeine and cortisol, at least the meaningful one. If you're a chronic caffeine user, meaning you drink caffeine every day or you've consumed caffeine every day for the previous 5 days, which is the typical framework in one of these studies, and then you drink caffeine, 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams, 300 milligrams, even an energy drink that includes caffeine and some other things, the increase in cortisol that you're going to experience is probably not that significant, unless it's a massively elevated dose of caffeine for you. However, if you're somebody who's not caffeine adapted, you're not drinking caffeine every day, you haven't had it for the last 5 days, then yes, you will experience a significant increase in cortisol levels. If, however, you're somebody who regularly drinks caffeine, you now know that it's not going to boost your cortisol levels that much, maybe a little bit, depending on how much you drink. However, it will prolong the duration of cortisol's effectiveness in your bloodstream. Well, it's probably not going to boost your cortisol levels that much if you're already viewing bright sunlight, you're hydrating. We'll talk about exercise and some other things in a moment. But if you're drinking that caffeine shortly after waking up or shortly close to when you get that big cortisol spike, it's going to make the downslope of that cortisol spike a bit more gradual. Or if you're drinking caffeine throughout the morning, a lot more gradual. Now, there's a second group of people that say, hey, I want my caffeine first thing in the morning, or I'm drinking my caffeine first thing in the morning, but then I'm crashing really hard in the late morning, crashing really hard in the afternoon, and it's not because I'm not sleeping well at night. It's like something's happening. This is where the recommendation that I've been making for some years now of delaying your caffeine by anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes comes about. You now know that caffeine for a habitual user is not going to increase your cortisol levels that much. However, you also now know that drinking caffeine will extend the life of cortisol somewhat. So the logic here is if you drink your caffeine not immediately after waking, but let's say an hour after waking or 90 minutes after waking, it's going to flatten out a bit the downslope of that cortisol as you transition from late morning into the early afternoon. a lot of reason why people crash in the afternoon. They get that extreme fatigue, typically after lunch. Yes, it can be due to eating too much at lunch. Yes, it can be due to eating too many starchy carbohydrates or sugars at lunch. It can be due to lack of sleep. But assuming that you're doing all the things right and you're still experiencing that crash in the afternoon, there's a good chance that it's because your morning cortisol peak, high enough or no, is coming down too fast. And in order to make it more gradual, you simply shift your caffeine intake a little bit later so that that diminishing caffeine level that it starts to occur around 10 a.m., 11 a.m., of course, all of this relates to exactly when you wake up, but that dropping level in caffeine isn't a steep cliff. It's a little bit more gradual. Okay, let's talk about exercise and its effects on cortisol. If you are accustomed to exercising in a particular way and at a particular time of day, the elevation in cortisol that you experience from that workout is going to be less than if it's a completely novel scenario, both in terms of time and the type of workout. So we can take a step back and say with certainty, exercise increases cortisol. However, if the form of exercise and the timing is very familiar to you, the amount of cortisol, and in particular the duration of cortisol increase, is not going to be that significant as compared to if it's a completely novel form or timing of exercise. However, exercise provides a very strong what's called entrainment cue. Entrainment cues are cues of things that we do. These could be meals, it could be light exposure, it could be exercise, it could be all sorts of things, even social engagement, that feed back onto the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and reinforce the timing of the cortisol release that the SCN causes. So there are these beautiful interactions between exercise, the SCN, and cortisol release that when we exercise at roughly the same period of time each day, it doesn't have to be right on the minute, but within the same 2 or 3 hour window each day. And since, like most people, you're probably not exercising every single day, perhaps 3 days a week, 4 days a week, ideally 5 or 6 days a week. When you do that, pretty soon you get a cortisol increase simply in response to the timing rolling around in a very Pavlovian way, even if you don't exercise. Now, you have to keep exercising to maintain that. But the key here is that when you exercise in the same 2 to 3 hour window each day, or at least 3 days a week, ideally 4, 5, 6 days per week, I do think it's important to have at least one complete rest day. When you do that, that big peak in cortisol that's endogenously generated by your SCN, that's just internally generated without doing anything else, it gets anchored to that stage of the day in a very solid way as compared to people who don't exercise early in the day. So the point here is that if you exercise at the same time of day for, say, 4 to 5, maybe 6 days per week, you just do that for a week. And it doesn't have to be, again, exactly at the same time you start, exactly at the same time you stop, plus or minus 30 minutes. What you'll find is that in the hour leading into that exercise, you will start to experience an increase in energy. And it's not just psychological. So if you're somebody who doesn't seem to have much energy, much get up and go in the morning, and you're getting your bright light, you're getting your hydration, maybe you're even drinking caffeine, you're doing all of that, and you're still feeling kind of sluggish, exercising for 3 or 4 days, not necessarily in a row, feel free to introduce a rest day as needed, but doing that across the course of a week for 4 to 6 days, where you're going to have more energy heading into the exercise, therefore more energy to exercise. And it's just going to be a positive feedback loop on your cortisol level.